Good morning, everybody. And first of all, let me thank MEI for the opportunity to be on this panel. MEI does amazing work, and I've certainly been the beneficiary of a lot of that work over my 30 years in the Foreign Service. And I have to say, it's really something special to be in a large room like this that's full early on a morning of people who are interested in the issues in the Middle East region. That's certainly consonant with what the interests of our country are in the region. And I see that there are lots of people who, especially young people, who going forward are prepared to pursue those interests. Let me start out by saying that, we're less than 1 year into this new Arab awakening. And as Steve points out, and as Deputy Secretary Burns pointed out last night in his remarks, it really is too early to firmly project what's going to happen in any given state, in any given political system, and it's certainly much too early to come up with judgments on whether the awakening is going to be, in very raw terms, a success or a failure. I do think it's clear that, as Tamara pointed out, that this new surge of popular activism, this yearning for democracy, especially led by young people, does represent the best chance for the peoples of the region to claim their rights, to empower themselves, to come up with more responsive governments, and for those governments to be more stable and better partners for those from the outside, including us. But I think it's a very, very far from knowable at this point whether that's going to happen or not. I think that, so far at least, the process that these countries are going through of getting to good, decent, democratic, representative elections seems to be going tolerably well. I think the Tunisia vote was actually a good one. I hope that similar efforts in Egypt come to pass very soon. We have another exercise in Morocco next week. But what's going to happen when these new governments come to power? Are they actually going to be able seriously to come to grips with the huge political, social, and especially economic issues that they're going to have to grapple with, the sorts of issues that create popular unrest and deprivation in the populations? So in a sense, we could have wonderful political reform. We could have the best elections in the world, and that is important. But how important is it going to be if the economic needs of the people aren't met? I don't think any of the governments, any of the peoples themselves, certainly nobody on this side of the ocean has the answer to questions like that right now. Now, clearly, the current focus in most Arab countries is very much domestic, very much what's going on in those places at this time. But will it remain so? Is there a possibility of some sort of intervening event, like changing the subject in a way that takes some of the focus off the domestic processes? I don't see that coming. But if, God forbid, we have some sort of regional war, that might change the equation somewhat. Tamara also mentioned media as a factor in what's been going on. And media coverage of the last year's events has been enormously important, I think, to creating and sustaining the momentum of what's happened in lots of these countries. If there's some sort of new media focus on these issues, will that make a difference? I'm not saying it is, but I think it's a question to watch. Just as it's too early to know whether the changes underway are actually going to deliver on the promise to the peoples of the region, I also think it's too early to know whether these changes are going to produce developments, produce governments that we can work effectively with. I certainly hope so, and I do agree that the more stable, the more rooted in popular support a government is, the better partner in theory that person should or that government should make. But that's rather an unproven proposition at this point. We're just going to have to try to make it so. Let me give a few remarks, please, on the overall U.S. approach to the Arab awakening, which I agree is a much better term than Arab Spring. Now, for my personal taste, early on, I think the USG approach had a little bit too much romance of revolution, but I think that actually over the weeks and months that followed the outbreak of these events, that the USG approach actually evened out to a very sensible place where we could make clear that as much as we supported the rights and the need for these peoples to try to claim their democratic rights and to create new systems that let them express those democratic rights, the fact of the matter is that even as we do support those changes and those efforts, we also have a lot of regular, standing, garden variety strategic interests that we have to pursue in parallel. And we can't choose to focus solely on one issue in most of these countries. Egypt is a very sterling example of the many things that we have going on. And this is something that I think that the USG has basically gotten right. And I would note that on the State Department side of things, which I'm most familiar with, the unique collection of individuals that we've had actually working on these issues has, in my mind, made a difference. First of all, we have a Secretary of State who not only has extremely high visibility, but she is kind of uniquely well qualified to comment on and pursue issues that deal with civil society. That's one of her things. I think she has credibility around the world. Bill Burns, there's no one who knows the region better, as you heard last night, and the good common sense that infuses everything that he does and says. We've had Jeff Feltman, who is an enormously intelligent, active assistant secretary. Tamara will blush, but she's done an amazing job of turning the MEI office into an office that, instead of looking solely at what we want people to do and trying to make them do it, instead, in my mind, that office is now something that seeks to ask people what it is they need to do their jobs and to try to give them those tools that they want. And believe it may be a subtle difference from times past, but believe me, it's a very real one. And now, most recently, we have Ambassador Bill Taylor, who has enormous experience in handling complicated transitions, especially those economic in nature, who's going to try to spearhead our efforts. I think that's going to be particularly important because, as I mentioned a bit earlier, there's every possibility that economic difficulties are going to be the banana peel in the path of really successful economic reform. So do pay a bit of attention to this collection of individuals who are actually working these issues inside our government, because I think it really is enormously important. But even with the right approach, and even with such excellent people working the issues, we do have a real sustainability issue. Are we going to be able to have the resources that we need to actually do the job? I think that remains to be seen. You heard Bill Burns say last night that the administration is still working the Congress to come up with the resource base to do what we think we need to do. If it turns out that some of these countries need massive economic assistance to help make their transition successful, are we going to be able to cough up those resources? It's a really hard question. I mean, maybe over time, as our economic and fiscal plight improves here, maybe there will be a different answer, but it's a very, very tough sell at this particular point. Let me mention as well that I give the administration kudos for opening up engagement with different Islamist groups with whom we really had either very sporadic contacts in the past or no contacts. It's important that they opened up such dialogues, but I think it's equally important to note that they did so really without fanfare. These groups are not treated as necessarily the vanguard of change and what's going to happen, and these are the people to talk to now. But instead, it's a much more prudent approach of these folks are one among many. We're talking with everybody, so of course we need to talk to them. I think that's very sensible. It's the right approach. I hope it continues, but I also see a sustainability issue in our dealings with Islamist movements and Islamist governments. I very much hope that in the new regional atmosphere that Islamist movements can move in moderate directions in an atmosphere of freedom and with an atmosphere of much less repression. But it's not at all clear that that's going to happen. I think we should try to encourage it, and dialogue is one way to encourage it, but we just don't know yet. And are we going to be able to continue as a government to deal with these folks if they don't moderate their approach, if instead the dynamic is one of competition along lines of who can be more Islamist and radical than the others? That's not necessarily going to happen, but it's something that we're going to have to keep an eye out for and try to tweak our policies and approaches along the way to get it right. I mentioned the Tunisian election a bit earlier. I think it's an interesting question whether Tunisia is going to be the bellwether, not only for other electoral exercises, but will the Nahda movement in particular also be some kind of bellwether for the development of the approach and ideology of other Islamist movements in the region? Don't think we know yet. A lot may depend on actually what happens in Tunisia and the success that Nahda and others may enjoy. It's probably much more likely that Egypt will be the bellwether by dint of size, by dint of the reputation and reach of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood into other Islamist movements in the region. There's an interesting question that arises. Some people would say, and I'm not one of them, but some people will say that what we're looking at this point is a region that's going to be characterized by a string of Muslim Brotherhood, that's a very broad term, but Muslim Brotherhood governments in the region. I don't think we're quite there, but if we do get there, what does that mean for regional political leadership dynamics? How does that change? Will a resurgent Egypt also assert a strong regional leadership role in such circumstances? What's going to be the role of states like Turkey, which is clearly making a bid for some sort of regional leadership, even though they're not Arabs and have that kind of self-limiting factor? What's Qatar going to do? I mean, they've staked out a very important role, both with political support, with monetary resources, and with the media, again, which Tammy pointed out earlier. What's Saudi Arabia going to do in circumstances like this? In particular, if we have a change in Syria that yields a Sunni-led government in that country, what's the competition for influence among all of these players in the region and indeed the Western powers going to be? It's going to be fascinating. It's going to be kind of a textbook example of competition for influence. It'll be fun to watch. So I think I'll stop at that point and just stop with a very, very general observation that as important and as fascinating as what's happening in each of these countries is, to me, the big enchilada, the big mango, you might even say, is going to be Egypt. What happens in Egypt? Will the civil society actors in Egypt and the military be able to make the necessary accommodations to keep things stable? Will the forces that rule Egypt be able to come to grips with the severe economic issues that they face? Will the secular elements of political life be able to overcome the disarray that has characterized them up to this point? And will the Muslim Brotherhood and associated movements be able to evolve in ways that are moderate and sensible, or will instead they move toward confrontation? You know, in Egypt, people always seem to find a way to, muddle through and make it happen, and that may be the best case scenario for a few years. But what happens there is going to be of enormous consequence to the region and of enormous consequence to the United States as we pursue our interests throughout the region. And I hope our former ambassador to Egypt here on my left will be able to answer some of those questions. Thank you.